Thank you very much for that introduction. My main hat actually is at a think tank in Washington. I work at the American Enterprise Institute. And I want to just start by saying thank you to all of you. I know that it's been a long day, but I still see that you've come in very large numbers, so I appreciate that. I also want to thank FIIDS for inviting me and Khandiraji, and also for Vijay Chattamalaji, who has always been very generous to me in sharing with me, in sharing his insights on various issues, not just foreign policy issues. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to keep my comments quite brief so that we can spend some more time on Q&A, and I'm sure that many of you will have lots of questions and answers because it's an interesting time in the US-India relationship. And so what I thought I'd talk about a little bit is why has India become important to the United States? Now, the answer that we often hear is, every time the two leaders of the two countries meet, we're all used to people talking about, the world's largest and the world's oldest democracy. But India and the US were the world's largest and the world's oldest democracies, even in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s. But they were not two countries that were particularly close. So, but what we've seen over the last 3 presidencies at least is a view in Washington which I think is accurate, but it's also a view that has been very beneficial to India. And that broadly comes down to the idea that the rise of India is good for the United States. And so what I'm going to do in my sort of brief remarks is just sort of unpack this a little bit and talk about why we think, why foreign policy makers, why successive administrations, both Democrats and Republicans, have come to this conclusion, and then sort of step back and look at each one of these 5 things and look at it in terms of where they may be headed, where there's room for optimism, where there may be some room for concern, in my view. Now, first of all, I have to say that I agree with Vijayji's presentation. I think that foreign policy has really been one of this government's standout successes over the last 3 years. You can feel a new sense of energy, you can see a new sense of commitment, and you find a lot of the old hesitations, not just on things like Pakistan and surgical strikes, but also many other relationships, including the relationship with the United States. A lot of the old hesitations have gone away. And I think to me, one of the standout moments, Vijay spoke a lot about the Prime Minister visiting many countries which other Prime Ministers had neglected. But one of the standout moments to me was in fact not him going, but who he called. And this was his very first Republic Day, when he had President Barack Obama as his chief guest. And it's a remarkable moment not just in the history of the US-India relationship, of course, but it's also a remarkable moment in Indian diplomatic history. Because until then, we had not had a Prime Minister who had the confidence to say, I'll call the President of the United States and we will stand together as equals. There was always this fear that if I call the President of the United States, will I be called a lackey of the US, or will I be seen as too close? And he just sort of, with one gesture, he swept away those decades of tentativeness and indecision in the US-India relationship. And that's just sort of one of many examples. Of course, he's going to Israel next week again, which is a sort of absolute landmark, which doesn't just speak of the strength of the bilateral relationship, but also speaks of a new self-confidence in Indian foreign policy, which is driven by Indian national interest. There is no reason for India to be tentative. There's no reason for India to be diffident or apologetic about a relationship with Israel, which is a very important relationship. And it's very nice to see that this Prime Minister symbolizes that new boldness. Now, coming back to this idea of US-India relations and why, and these sort of the 5 factors that I think have driven the importance of India in Washington. I would say the first one is the rise of China. As long as we were locked in the Cold War, not only were India and the US basically, broadly speaking, in different camps, even though India was officially an online country. I think India's importance has really become more and more clear, particularly for folks who look at Asia and folks who are concerned with the developments we've seen over the past decade. Now, neither country wants to contain China. Neither country wants to be an enemy of China. Neither country both countries want a good, harmonious, productive relationship with China. But when the United States looks around the world, it does not want an Asia that is dominated by one country. And when it looks around the rest of Asia, it can see only two countries that have the self-confidence, the wherewithal, the size to not become US lackeys, but to stand up for their own rights. And one of those, of course, is Japan, the other one is India. So the rise of China has really changed the profile of India in Washington. The second, of course, is the rise of Islamic terrorism. Now, you could drive all the way from New Delhi to Jerusalem, and you would not pass a single country in between that has a tradition of democracy, pluralism, rule of law. And I think that is quite a remarkable thing. And there is a growing understanding, as the Prime Minister also mentioned today, that terrorism is a global problem, it's not a local problem. I remember in 1993 when we had the Mumbai blasts, and so many lives were taken, it was barely an issue for the rest of the world. It was treated as a local issue. When the Mumbai attacks happened, it was a horrific issue. I think it was very poorly handled by the previous government, but the approach of the world towards this scourge had changed. And I personally believe that if the government of India at that time had taken slightly more resolute action, the world would have applauded. So this rise of Islamic terrorism and the importance of India as a counter and a shared understanding of the suffering that India has been through has been a second major factor that has played in terms of making India more important. The third, of course, is the rise of the Indian economy. Now, under socialism, for the longest time between 1947 and 1991, India was not viewed as an economy that had much potential. Since 91, it has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world, albeit from a very low base. This has naturally opened up many large corporations. You saw the very impressive list of CEOs who were there to meet with the Prime Minister today. They view the country in terms of commercial opportunity, in terms of a market, in terms of a place where they get many of their most talented executives, a place where they do a lot of their backroom work, increasingly high-end research and development. So the integration of India into the global economy and the growth of India as a market has completely changed the complexion in terms of how the country is viewed. The fourth, just one more after this, is what I call the idea of India as an example, or the New Delhi model. Now, I used to live in Indonesia, and the battle really in places like Southeast Asia is between, they look at two choices. They say, do we want to go down the path that China has taken? And we must all acknowledge that China has been very successful in many ways. It has built world-class cities, it has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, it has established a very powerful military, and so on and so forth. So one model was the China model, which obviously is successful but authoritarian. And the other model is the India model, which has managed, it has perhaps not progressed as fast as China, but after China, India is the country that has pulled the second largest number of people out of poverty. And India has managed to do well while safeguarding democracy. India has not rejected democracy, it has not rejected freedom of the press, it has remained open. And so the idea that is naturally attractive to many people, obviously in Washington and in the United States, is the idea that India geographically may be part of the East, but in many real political ways, it is part of the West, in the sense of having the same values, having the same institutions, having a judiciary, having a free press, and so on. So that is something also that has really sort of sold the idea of Indian soft power. I would argue as an aside though, and we could get into this more in Q&A, that is probably more attractive in India than it is in many of these Asian countries, because a lot of them have a very sort of materialistic drive to just get ahead. But the topic of my talk is why India has grown in prominence and popularity in the US. And certainly in the US, India as a democratic model has been something that is extremely important. And finally, we come to all of you in the room over here, the diaspora. It's an extremely significant diaspora, not just in terms of, we've all heard the numbers before, in terms of its size, more than 3 million people, in terms of per capita income, in terms of the average education, in terms of the outstanding personal success that many people have achieved. But it's also a living bridge. It's a living and breathing bridge between the two countries. One of the most famous examples of this, in a very real way, is why George Bush, who made the most dramatic turn towards India. And one of the story goes that, George Bush, first of all, he would sort of have Indians in he would meet Indians in Texas, he would meet many doctors, highly educated people, and he would look at it and say, look, this is a model community. This community has done so well. Clearly there's something going on with these people. I want to reach out and learn more about this country too. Obviously there were many other reasons too, but the role of the diaspora has been huge. Now let me quickly go over these 5 and tell you where I'm optimistic and where I think we should need to be a little bit careful. I think the role of the rise of China as a factor is not going anywhere. China, if anything, is growing stronger, but it is also growing more aggressive. For the longest time while China was rising, the Chinese kept their power under wraps. They downplayed their strength. That is no longer the case. If you look at the way they have been towards India on issues such as Masood Azhar and terrorism, if you look at their claims in the South China Sea, if you look at it across a range of issues, China is basically, to use an Americanism, playing hardball. That isn't going anywhere. There's going to be a natural effect, and this is going to naturally continue to drive the US and India closer to each other. Similarly, the problem of Islamic terrorism, unfortunately, is not going anywhere. Just in the last year and a half or so, we have seen horrific attacks in Paris, in London, in Leeds, in Orlando, you name it. And almost 2 decades now after 9/11, we have, unfortunately, we have yet to come to terms with this phenomenon. We have yet to find an effective way to deal with this. But I would argue that there is one sign that is positive, which is that in country after country, not just India, not just the United States, in country after country, the public is dissatisfied with its politicians on this question. And the public wants to elect politicians who they feel can make them feel safe and can do something about this problem. So again, huge scope for cooperation. I imagine we're going to see some interesting announcements tomorrow. The economy is continuing to grow, but I would argue that it's very important that, and I think here the US makes a mistake by focusing too much on market access and too little on economic reform. Now, eventually, what is in India's interest and the interest of the United States and the interest of the world is for India to rapidly end poverty. The rapid end to poverty is only going to come when the economy grows even faster than it's growing now and lifts even more people out of poverty. And that is linked really to a set of economic reforms that people have been debating for a long time. I would say right now the situation is not bad, but I would also say that this is something that concerns me in the long term. When I look at the 5-year, 10-year, 15-year prognosis, I think that India will need to remain a fast-growing economy. And it shouldn't just say we're growing faster than China, because frankly, it's easy to grow faster than China now when China is 4 times richer. We're growing on a much smaller base. it should benchmark itself against how China grew when China was at the same level of per capita income. So in the long term, I would say that emphasis on this, on the reform program is going to have to continue, because unless this sort of, the economic growth continues, not just for the foreign policy reasons are that this is a very important component, not just of making India attractive to other countries, but also of India as a model, and India as a democratic, successful example. And finally, it comes to the diaspora, which I think has done a tremendous job. But again, to echo some of the comments that the Prime Minister made, and this is something that Vijay and I have had a chance to discuss before also, is that if you look around and look at the people in this room, almost all of you, I would imagine, has a direct link to India. Why are there so few people in this room whose link to India is not direct? And by that I mean people who were not born in India. And I think that if you look around and you look at that, and in many ways, these are sort of feel-good events, so in these feel-good events people are not supposed to but I will say this because it concerns me. It concerns me that the size of our diaspora and the enthusiasm of the diaspora among people who have a direct connection to India because they were born there remains high. But it withers very, very rapidly in generational terms. And as a community, we have yet to find a way to make the involvement of the diaspora sustainable in a way that it is going to continue to be the kind of bridge that we'd like it to be between the United States and India. And on that note, I'd like to thank you.